when a long-running series like the James Bond franchise has to recast its central iconic character, that can be quite a highly problematic moment. Especially when an actor has become so embedded within the role that it can be sometimes difficult for audiences to identify with a new actor, especially if they bring to the part something which is very different. The changeover point, the beginning, is all important in maintaining the faith, ensuring that Bond fans aren't alienated or that they lose confidence in the franchise itself. This can be achieved through various strategies and can be dependent on not just that network of collaborators, but I feel it's the skill of the actual director, who for me is the key figure in drawing together all of the creative strands and making them work in conjunction with each other, especially if that director is someone of great skill and insight. So I posit that the best directors in the series are the ones who understand Bond's cultural prominence. They know how to present and when to present Bond as an icon within the film, and they use the film to discuss the character as a symbolic referent that speaks to its cultural status, rather than just as an important character within the film's narrative and within the established rules of the franchise.
You're joking.
Terence Young had an easier job in presenting little-known actor Sean Connery to the world in 1962's Dr. No. Simply because although the books were very popular and fairly well regarded critically, there were no real cinematic expectations about Connery in the role. He had no competition and no one to be really compared to. Its introduction of Sean Connery in 007 is iconic more for its placement than its style. Connery commands the screen, unleashes the kind of charisma that kept him in the role successfully for 4 further Bond films, until he left after You Only Live Twice in 1967. For global audiences, this was the beginning of something that went on to revolutionise mainstream cinema, representation and cultural narratives around ownership, travel, masculinity and visual style. With Terence Young, Guy Hamilton and Lewis Gilbert, all 3 directors brought sequences to the table that went beyond Bondian. Each acknowledged in their films that the series was now a global cultural statement by bringing in images that went beyond logic and consciously evoked the idea of Bond as icon, something bigger than the actual story and was more about Bond and cultural status. The best Bond directors understood that at some point a nod towards Bond as something symbolic was not only a clever gesture and a useful change in register within the films themselves. This was also an important moment that spoke to the position of the franchise as a global phenomenon at that time. An example here is Lewis Gilbert's aerial shot of James Bond running from a horde of henchmen in Kobe Docks from You Only Live Twice. This is more than just a fight sequence. With John Barry's music raising in pitch, the exclusion of dialogue and the use of one long take to capture movement, and the pullback here to review location and action, the sequence moves from the literal and the functional into the symbolic. At that point, the sequence is not about the plot, but is a kind of an extra textual comment and reflection on Bond as icon in 1967. When Sean Connery stepped down, the producers Albert R. Broccoli and Harry Saltzman were understandably concerned. Maybe their era-defining franchise was about to become derailed. So important culturally, remember, had the films become by that point? One could argue that the films were defining the 1960s. So the casting of Australian model George Lazenby was understandably causing great anxiety at that time. Many felt that Connery's take on 007 was definitive, and perhaps impossible to match or replicate in terms of impact and audience connection. So putting director Peter Hunt in charge of the 1969 debut film On Her Majesty's Secret Service was in retrospect one of the best decisions they could have made. Hunt had been a series editor at Eon. He'd been responsible for some of the franchise's most definitive moments, such as the prescient fast cutting of the Red Grant James Bond battle in From Russia with Love in 1963, along with many other key sequences. Hunt was also a keen cineast, and he was a fan of European and auteur cinema. And really he was keen to imbue the Bond films with a corresponding sense of high style. Hunt also innately recognised that the Bond series had moved from the popular to the iconic in itself, and he incorporated this in the opening traditional pre-credit sequence of his film. The opening sequence serves several purposes. The plot mechanisms introduces Bond on the trail of arch-enemy Blofeld from the last film, has found himself following the activities of Tracy Draco, who will become an important figure later on in the film and indeed within the entire Bond canon. Secondly, the tone is set, as the sequence reminds us this is a Bond film, although set at a particular, edgier and maybe slightly heightened pace, which acts as a lure, and also as a reassurance. Thirdly, the pre-credit sequence itself reassures viewers. This is a Bond film, and a new act won't mean too many changes to the series that they've come to know and love in formal terms. We are also introduced to Bond not by his face tellingly, but the signifiers we attach to the character, and the conventions and the elements that we would associate with the series. This is important. In this case we see cigarettes, a fast car, an exotic location, a gun, the promise of intrigue, a problem to be solved, a setup including action, henchmen, and a beautiful, possibly dangerous unknown woman in need of rescue. All of this reduces Bond to components. John Barry's music does much of the heavy lifting here too, partly because he and Peter Hunt were aware of Lazenby's shortcomings as an actor, and also they wanted to impart that the music in itself was becoming kind of a character within the film. It was an important layer of signification. The lack of Bond's face directly in shot tells us it doesn't matter who plays Bond, but the conventions are more important. And these set of choices are actually quite complex, because what they do is they reinforce the style of the film, which feels like a kind of Cinzano Bianco advert from the 1960s, maybe allied to a more expensive soundtrack possibly. All of these strategies come together in the opening sequence, also to provide comment on Bond as icon. These elements are created to act in the symbolic register, which is where the important work is done, reducing the white noise of information presented in the film to something which stands apart from that, from functionality, and moves into the area of the iconic.
This never happened to the other fella.
Now, as we've established, beginnings are all important. Roger Moore's tenure as James Bond was certainly well received in 1973 with Live and Let Die. It was striking enough, it had plenty of spectacular Bondian moments. But despite Goldfinger director Guy Hamilton's presence, it wasn't really until he left and Moore's third film arrived in 1977, The Spy Who Loved Me, where the idea of Bond as icon became addressed in clearer terms. Returning director Lewis Gilbert correctly recognised that to restate the franchise and the character's cultural prominence, a moment had to go beyond the audacious and the spectacular. A moment had to go into an image that told us this wasn't just a film, but an ideal of cultural prominence, and it should be recognised as such. Which is something his pre-credit sequence in The Spy Who Loved Me ably demonstrates. That sequence, that image, pulls together legacy, intent, attitude and parody to reconfirm Bond for a 1977 audience. And this is really what ushers in Moore's fairly tentative post-Connery reinvention. With this film, Moore begins properly. Sadly, second unit director John Glenn continued as the series director, and it's no accident that as mainstream cinema learned how to deal with action, humour and scale from the series itself, the Eon franchise began to slowly unwind creatively. Timothy Dalton's run, which began in 1987 with the Glenn-directed The Living Daylights, never really had much of a chance. There were plenty of deft action choices made in both his films, and undoubtedly both efforts supplied a few gripping Bondian action sequences. But it wasn't until Eon dropped John Glenn and brought in ex-professionals director Martin Campbell in 1995 to direct GoldenEye, where the Bond idea became iconic once more. Whatever one's opinion on Pierce Brosnan's role, and opinions are undoubtedly mixed, Campbell is a director who totally understands the importance of a moment to define and exemplify why the thing is an icon. He uses one or two tight visual moments to fully establish Brosnan in the part. He imparts a sense of attitude and most notably confidence, and reminds us of Bond's broader symbolic resonance within global culture itself. It goes beyond being simply Bondian to once again stepping outside the narrative just enough without breaking the story's hold on us. One could argue the film itself exhibits a kind of self-reflexive postmodern aesthetic throughout, which undoubtedly matches the times of the 1990s. There are several key moments in GoldenEye. Brosnan's centering of himself by straightening his tie whilst driving a tank through St. Petersburg was quoted by Sam Mendes in the 2012 Skyfall. Brosnan barely acknowledges a passing bullet. There are deliberate nods towards Bond's phallic nature and the placement of relics from previous decades, which are testament to Campbell's understanding of the character and its placement within a larger context. The GoldenEye so firmly established Pierce Brosnan who was subsequently underserved by fairly pedestrian films later on, again is a reminder of Campbell's reading of the times, and certainly had recognised that 1960s icons had begun resurfacing in popular culture around the film, which complemented this version of the character. Thus, when Daniel Craig took over the role in the 2006 Casino Royale, a much-needed reboot of the franchise, Campbell's willingness to make bold choices formally ensured that Craig's interpretation was fully supported by the film around it. The black and white pre-credit sequence is particularly bold. Campbell chooses black and white to signify the past, the Cold War, history itself, and to rekindle the kind of shadows and visual formal compression of light and space one would associate with Hollywood noir thrillers of the 1940s and 1950s, reminding us the origins of James Bond itself is that of a pulp novel back in 1953 that owes much to Chandler and his ilk. Campbell understands the nature of Bond as icon and plants various signals throughout the film to remind us of his importance and also of our own knowledge. Casino Royale is as much a reboot as it is an affirmation of the myth of Bond itself, and it repositions that myth as well as reminding us of it and asking us to correlate our own memories and experiences with that myth. Since then, Sam Mendes and perhaps the most underrated director of recent films, Mark Forster, have not only followed Campbell's lead, but incorporated these ideas more explicitly into their own films to lesser and greater degrees of success. Today there is every reason to believe that we may be in a more visually developed cinema culture, but the manner in which these visual ideas are presented is always dependent on the creative intelligence at work behind those choices. It's how they order the iconography, it's how they choose to manipulate it. As when Bond begins again, we need to be reassured and reminded that this isn't just a spy series. It's a story about us and our own relationship to popular culture and cinema. I'm Van Norris, and you've listened to me babbling on about James Bond.